My guest is Michael Kellett, who is co-founder and executive director of Restore the Northwoods. Michael has over 35 years of experience in the land conservation movement. In 1994, he wrote the first white paper proposing a 3.2 million acre Maine Woods National Park and Preserve and has been actively involved in efforts to restore endangered wildlife such as the eastern wolf, Atlantic salmon, and Canada lynx in efforts to protect federal and state public lands from unsustainable logging and development, and efforts to revive the national parks movement. Michael and his organization, Restore.org, have filed petitions that led to the protection of the Atlantic salmon and Canada lynx under the Federal Endangered Species Act. They have won legal protection for a rare old growth forest in Mount Wachusett in Massachusetts and have pioneered efforts to restore the wolf in the northeastern United States. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So we talked the other day on the phone, and you treated me to an hour of just your expertise. So let's go back to kind of a big picture and share with me, if you would, what is the current state of U.S. forests and the forest industry?
Well, the forests we have today are the result of several hundred years after European settlers came. They immediately started cutting down all the forests, working from the east to the west. And fortunately, by the time they got to the Rockies, some people were wise enough to see that we ought to try to save something, and we created public lands. We kept the lands that were started out as public, because all the original lands were not owned by anybody; they were owned by everybody. And so we have public lands in the west. In the east, the public has bought back lands that had been privatized, and so that's why we have parks and public forests in the east. But for until recently, the concept of forests was you grow them and you cut them down, and the purpose is to provide timber for human consumption, and that the best thing we can do is to cut down trees and make them into houses and tables. And so we thought we should cut down all the old growth forests and never let forests get very old in the future. And that's what they were well into doing on our national forests until recently. And now scientists are catching on to the fact that mature, i.e. trees that are, in the 100-year-old or so age, are actually very valuable. Forests like that are very valuable. And in fact, almost all the eastern forests are young, relatively young like that. And then old growth forests, most of the old growth forests, the big old trees, and the whole ecosystem are gone, they've been cut down and they're growing back. But there's no push to protect mature and old growth forests. There's national interest in. So the U.S. Forest Service is performing, and the Bureau of Land Management, an inventory, and is planning to do update their plans to manage mature and old growth forests. And they just came out with their proposal, and it's basically more of the same. And so there's been pushback, and Restore the Northwoods has been a part of this, to say enough is enough. We've been cutting and cutting and cutting our forests. We need to stop cutting old growth forests and mature forests on public lands, and step back and take a fresh look at this whole thing. And unfortunately, the forestry establishment and the U.S. Forest Service and the state forestry agencies and state wildlife agencies, they are totally in the mode of wanting to cut forests. Active management, they call it, which is really logging or burning or mowing or herbiciding the problem is, and this has not changed over the years, we have the people who are controlling our forests, and that's public and industrial forests. Private owners, small private owners can, they control their own forest, and that's a whole different thing. But if you're talking about public forests and state and federal forests, and that's hundreds of millions of acres of land, these guys believe that everything should be managed, and they know how to do it. And so anything that limits management of forests, they think is bad. So what we've got is more and more, all of our forests are being manipulated constantly, except for national parks, state parks, wilderness areas, national monuments, the forests that are protected, it's only about 12-13% of the US is permanently protected from logging and other resource extraction. So all the rest is potentially open to logging and exploitation. And so we and others think that there is a concept called 30 by 30, where scientists around the world are now saying we need to protect about 30% and as much as 50% of the earth from logging and other resource extraction, if we want to save the full range of wildlife, if we want to store enough carbon and prevent release of carbon to start mitigating climate change. And we now know that healthy forests are really good for people too, that we need clean water, clean air. They cool the local climate. So there's a new appreciation for forests. There's a new appreciation that we need action to protect forests. The trouble is, the powers that be are not doing it. We've got no plan in the U.S. to significantly expand forest protection. On the other hand, we've got the same old guys who are doubling down on wanting to log the forests and manage them endlessly. Mm-hmm. And so what I've been doing is working on both ends of the spectrum, trying to debunk the arguments that they're using to claim that we need to manage all of our forests, and at the same time trying to get large areas of forest and other ecosystems permanently protected, especially as national parks or monuments, but also wilderness and other protective reserves and so forth.
So you named a few benefits of forests. Talk about those benefits. You mentioned cooling and clean water, et cetera.
Yeah, we really, I mean, when the Pilgrims came over, they just were trying to survive, and they had all these trees, and they said, oh, we can use these for houses and fuel and all kinds of other things, and let's cut them down and use them. But over time, we've learned that forests are way more complex than we used to think. So one of the things that forests do is they stabilize the soil. We now know that soil it depends on the forest, but in the eastern U.S., about 50% of carbon is stored in the soil of a forest. The root systems and actually the roots store carbon in the soil itself. So, and for people who are not experts on climate change and so forth, one of the drivers of climate change was cutting down so many forests. So we've reduced the world's forests by about 1/3 from what they were even 1,000 years ago or so. So all of that carbon got spewed out into the atmosphere, but it was not enough in the past alone to drive serious climate change. But then when the Industrial Revolution came along, we started really spewing out fossil fuel carbon. And so climate change is driven largely by all those fossil fuel emissions, but also the cutting down forests, burning them. And on the other hand, we know that forests absorb carbon from the air, carbon dioxide, which is what is driving, mostly carbon dioxide is what's driving climate change. And then they store this carbon in the trunk, in the leaves, in the roots, in the soil. And a lot of trees can grow for several hundred years. And of course, we know that sequoias and redwoods can grow for thousands of years. And so forests, if you leave them alone, they keep this carbon stored and safe and out of the atmosphere. So they're vital if we want to, the international scientific agencies all agree that if we want to fight climate change, we not only have to stop spewing out so much carbon from fossil fuels, burning oil and gas and whatever, but we have to find a way to reabsorb this extra carbon that got spewed out into the atmosphere over the last 150 years or so. And forests are the only proven way to do that. If we leave forests alone, let them grow back, which is called proforestation, they'll gradually absorb more and more and more of that carbon and keep it stored. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown in the eastern U.S., the forests are only storing about half or less of their potential carbon stored. So if we leave them alone, they can double the amount of carbon and that's going to come from the air. Forests are also critical for biodiversity because the forest ecosystems are the most biodiverse in terms of the range of plants and animals and insects and molds and lichens and so forth. And of course, the most biodiverse forests are mainly tropical forests, but also temperate forests, like in the U.S., are still very biodiverse, especially southern Appalachian and forests in places like Alabama and so forth that didn't get covered with glaciers. They're super biodiverse as well. So protecting forests, it keeps the homes of wildlife and plants and animals intact. On the other hand, scientists are concerned that we are losing wildlife species at a rate that's never been seen in human times, and that 1 million species could go extinct by the end of the 21st century if we don't protect their habitats, and many of them are forest species. And yet, we're cutting forests around the world at a rapid pace, including in the U.S. So in biodiversity and climate, the biodiversity and climate side of forests is what benefits humans, because humans need a moderate climate, and forests are critical to that. They need food and water and air, clean air and so forth, and forests either provide them directly or indirectly. One of the problems recently in the U.S. that's grown is, for example, Lyme disease, which is spread by a tick that is hosted on white-footed mice and white-tailed deer, and those species do expand in numbers when you cut down the forest, if you clear cut a forest. So if you leave forests alone, they can still survive, but they're not in as large numbers, and they don't spread as much of the disease. And there are many other diseases where species that could spread disease thrive in disturbed, fragmented habitats. They don't like dark, deep interior forests. So it's really, we're shooting ourselves in the foot when we cut forests down. Even aside from using from the wood, that's of course wood's useful, but there are so many other values of leaving the forest alone, and scientists know that, but the people controlling our forests don't get it.
Well, a couple of questions come to mind. One is, what's the nature of the biological diversity that tends to, biological diversity tends to increase over time if you leave the forest alone. It seems to me a lot of that biological diversity is in the plants, some of it is in the animals, some of it's in the fungi and in the soil. So, give us an idea of what occurs over the course of time when you leave the forest alone and allow it to grow.
Right. Well, when you leave the forest alone, um, the trees get older, all the plants continue growing, but then what happens over time is some trees die of old age, or they get a disease, or there's a tornado that comes through, or there's a hurricane, um, and it blows down some of the trees. In some places, fire is an issue, though not in most of the places in the east. Fire, except along the coast, southern coast, fire is not really that big a factor, but there are plenty of disturbances that happen, and so over time. Um, the forests get more and more complex in their structure. They get their structure changes. And so you got some big old trees that survive. You got mid-sized trees that are younger, and then you got young trees that sprouted where an old tree fell down, for example, and there was an opening. And then those openings provide habitat for a different type of species than like to live in a deep, dark interior forest. And so if you leave a forest alone, let it grow, and that's what happened, of course, until 1600 everywhere. Native Americans really had pretty minimal impact on the forests. There weren't that many of them, and they had pretty basic technology, and they were fine. Just taking what they needed, and things worked pretty well. So, but if we leave a forest alone now, it's not going to be exactly the same. But for example, in Massachusetts, forests are growing back, and many of the forests here now are about 80 or even 100 years old, where they haven't been cut for a while. They're starting to get these old growth structural complexity, and the longer we leave them alone, the more diversity there will be. The simplest kind of and it's not even a forest, but the simplest biodiversity is in a plantation where they mow down all the trees and then plant whatever, yellow pine or slash pine or whatever that grows fast, and it's like a cornfield. It's super non-biodiverse. You have a very limited amount of species, and those they're not even forests, they're plantations. They store a lot less carbon too, because the trees grow really fast. They don't have time to absorb as much carbon. They never let them get very old. They usually mow them down when they're about 30 to 40 years old. So people often will say, oh, they they clear cut that area, they cut that forest. Did they replant? And what I tell people is, you shouldn't be cutting anywhere where you have to plant.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be cutting a forest that can't grow back, number one, and you shouldn't be cutting all the forests anyway. But planting it's not a forest when you plant, it's a plantation. It's like a cornfield. Nobody confuses a cornfield with a prairie. And we shouldn't be calling plantations forests. They're not.
Right. So the timber industry, I'm sure I don't know this firsthand, but I can only surmise that the timber industry does a lot of greenwashing because they're supporting this or that tree planting effort. But as you just said, tree planting is not the same thing. If you cut down a mature forest and then pretend to plant trees, and then what are those trees going to grow into? They're going to grow into a monoculture, and then later on you're going to cut them down for timber. And in the meantime, you have not had the benefits of a mature forest.
Right. Yeah, the timber industry, and not just them, the all any industry that has an interest in cutting down trees or manipulating them, and that's not just the timber industry; it's the paper industry, of course, but biomass,
Mhm.
energy industry, the wildlife, the hunting groups, the wildlife managers who love to manipulate and get their favorite species, they all have an interest in convincing people that cutting trees is good and it's necessary, that the forest isn't healthy if you're not constantly cutting and trimming and whatever. Now there's a whole fire industry that's grown up around the idea that, oh my God, everything's burning, and the only way to deal with that is to reduce that hazardous fuel by thinning the forests, and which is totally made up. It's fraudulent. It's not real. There's plenty of science showing that that's, except around your house or something, thinning the forest, it doesn't seriously reduce at all the likelihood or intensity of fires. And in fact, when you open the forest up by thinning it, you get more wind blowing through, you get more, the forest floor gets heated by the sun and dried out. You always have stuff left over after you've logged, that slash and so forth. All of that is very flammable. And they'll usually take out the biggest trees because you can sell them and make money. So you end up with small, younger trees, and the trees that burn the least are the biggest old trees. The reason they got big and old is they resisted being burned. So people have heard all this stuff about fire and talk about propaganda. The industry has just spewed out propaganda, scaring everybody into thinking our forests are just going to go up in flames if we don't manage, which means log, the forests. And that's the opposite of what we ought to be doing.
Yeah, they might say they're going in to take out waste wood, but when they come out with trees, old trees, big logs, anything but waste wood. Besides, the term waste wood is inherently like misleading to think that any wood is waste wood. If you have a dead tree, that's not wasted,
Right. In fact, it's not a real forest if you don't have dead trees. That's what a real forest, they have standing snags, you have trees that fell down, and anyone who spends any time in the forest, they know that a fallen log has all kinds, you roll it over, there are all kinds of different animals and salamanders and bugs and mold that live on that tree, on that fallen tree. And there are woodpeckers and other species that use snags to nest, and to find bugs to eat and so forth. So you take those away, and you've taken away the home and the habitat for a lot of species. So it's really it's this mentality that everything was put here for humans to use, to consume, and leaving it is just, that's where the term waste comes from. What that means is it's stuff that we don't use for consumption. And one of the biggest problems is, of course, we're speaking of waste, we waste huge amounts of wood and paper and so forth. I just was looking at an EPA report where only like 17% of wood is recycled or reused in any way. Almost all the rest is landfilled or burned. And of course, that ends up worsening climate change. So there's a huge amount of waste. So when they tell us, oh, we got to cut these forests down because we need the wood, and we're going to run out of wood and so forth. Well, I don't hear any of those guys saying, oh, let's stop wasting so much wood. We need to be more careful. The average house in the US is about 50 years old when it gets torn down or remodeled. And what happens to and they're mostly wood. What happens to all that wood? Well, it gets burned or landfilled. And then they cut down more trees to rebuild the house or whatever. So we still act as if trees are like this endless resource, and we can just mow them all down and no problem. So we really need to change the way we think about this. And the trouble is, we've got these entrenched bureaucracies that don't want to change. They are stuck and part of it is they're subsidized by taxpayers. So all the trees that are cut down on public land, just about all of them, just about everywhere, the logging is subsidized, meaning the cost of all the foresters and their trucks and the fuel and the roads and building roads and keeping them up and the offices and paperwork and all that. That's a cost to run these public lands. And trouble is, they get less money back when they sell the trees to logging companies than we spend for all this infrastructure, and it's a lot less. And it's because all the logging that's happened up till now, they've really, they don't ever let the trees get old enough to be really valuable. So
Let me
we're
ask you
cutting
about
and cutting and cutting and losing money at it, and we're paying to cut our own forest down.
exactly. So subsidies are a big issue. Subsidies, in my view, is a form of externality where you're
Right,
shifting the cost, where a business, like anything related to the timber industry, is a business that's wants to make a profit. And the
right,
only way they can make a profit in many cases is if they're shifting the costs onto the consumer or
yeah,
onto the taxpayer. And you sent me an article entitled Environmentally Harmful Subsidies in the U.S., issue number 1, the federal logging program. So,
yeah.
how else, besides what you've named, how else is is the federal logging program like industry subsidies at the expense of taxpayers?
Well, the other indirect subsidy is don't uh, we don't tally up the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are spewed out by the logging industry, which make climate change worse. So here it's more and more obvious that there are a lot of costs involved in dealing with climate change. You've got sea level rise, so you've got flooding, and plus you have flooding from hillsides that have been denuded. You have loss of biodiversity, and that say you lose a bunch of species, and all of a sudden part of the chain of the food chain is gone, and then that ripples down the whole system. You've got all these roads, which not only cost a lot of money to keep up, but they lead to erosion and so forth, and foul the water supplies. So water supplies are damaged. So there's a bunch of secondary damage that, aside from the fact that we're subsidizing the cost, just the direct cost, is that we're not even accounting for all these indirect costs that are resulting from logging. If you really had to pay the true cost, wood would be a lot more expensive. And
Exactly.
all of
And,
a sudden, people would value wood more. They would still maybe use
yeah,
it, but they wouldn't waste it. They would not use it for cheap housing that's going to get torn down. They would use it for maybe paneling or beautiful furniture or whatever. Uh, and you think about it, if you go to Europe, go to France or Spain or Germany, most of the houses are not built from wood. They're built from stone, from brick, because their trees were cut down long ago. And the only places where they have a lot of wood houses is Scandinavia, where they've ruined their forests. They've turned many of their forests into plantations. So that's not a model. And in the tropics, you can't really use wood for houses because of termites and mold and mildew. So they use either things like
mud.
straw or whatever, or they use concrete, stucco, whatever. So we we shouldn't even be using wood for a lot of the things we're using it for, but it's cheap. It's super cheap, and it's because of all the externalities that we're not paying for.
Among those externalities that are, kind of priceless, hard to put a value on, is the loss of wildlife habitat. We don't really have a good way of placing a value on the value of other species, and I think other species have a right to thrive. I mean, we have to kill to eat, and whether it's killing an animal or a plant, we need to do some of that. But I think that at the species level, they have a right to thrive. So let's talk about some of the animal species that are in forests. You've been instrumental in protecting wolves. You're trying to bring back the eastern wolf and I think the lynx and the Atlantic salmon. So, what are some of the benefits that these animals provide to the forest?
Salmon, they depend on clean water, free-flowing rivers, and unfortunately, Atlantic salmon have been reduced to just a tiny population. But in the West, we've now learned that salmon depend on uh, that forests are interlinked with salmon and vice versa, and because you won't have free-flowing rivers, there won't be any river. If you cut down all the trees, the rivers get fouled and they dry up. And so now we're seeing them removing big dams like on the Snake River and so forth out west for the salmon. So uh, and then so it works both ways with salmon. With lynx, for example, they eat a lot of smaller animals that without predators, that animals get overpopulated, like snowshoe hare and so forth, and then they starve to death or they eat themselves out of house and home, or even larger animals. For example, with wolves, on Isle Royale National Park in Michigan, it's a famous interplay between wolves and moose. There are no deer there. It's an island, so the wolves and the moose walked across the ice from Canada. It's closer to Canada than the U.S. years ago, and the moose. I think the moose came over first, if I'm remembering correctly, and they were getting to the point where there were too many of them, and they were eating all the vegetation. They were starving and getting disease. And then wolves managed to come across. I think that was the late 40s, 1940s. And of course, they chowed down on all these moose. And it's a famous case study where the two balanced each other out back and forth over many decades. And then the wolves got canine distemper, which they got from dogs. Isn't a natural thing for them to normally have. And there was there were other things like some accidents where a female wolf fell into a mine shaft, a couple of them maybe, because they're just these old copper mine shafts. And it's not that large an island that there weren't like hundreds of wolves to begin with. So the wolf population was dangerously low. And guess what happened? The moose started exploding in population, and there was a huge problem growing with vegetation being overbrowsed, which means young plants can't get a good start. Trees aren't able to come back and regenerate. So what they did is they reintroduced some wolves from Canada to augment the population that was left of wolves. And it was pretty controversial because some people didn't want them to mess around since it's a wilderness. My feeling is we have screwed things up so badly.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a species that was there without our help originally. And, it's largely because of us that they were almost disappeared from the island, and it's damaging the ecosystem. So to me, that was, I generally don't believe in messing around with nature, but that really was sort of fixing something that was fixable that we had a lot to do with. So, and now the wolves are doing great. The moose are back, are back in balance. In contrast to northern New England, where there are a lot of moose, and there are too many moose, and so what's happening is they are eating themselves into problems. In some places also, a lot of them now get ticks and even die from being bled out by ticks. And part of in wolves now would take advantage of sick and injured moose, and those are the animals that they often will take out. And they'll also go after young animals. So they naturally will pare down the population, so you don't have as many, and especially sick and injured animals are the ones because they're easier to catch. Well, Maine, there's no natural enemy or natural predator for moose at all. So you got like 50,000 moose. And I love moose, but doesn't do them a favor not to have a natural predator. Deer, there are deer in northern Maine, not as many. And there are coyotes, which came from the west and have filled some of the wolf niche, but they're not as big as wolves, so they have trouble taking down a moose. They can take down deer, usually not a really big adult. So they partly are filling that. But what happens is you mess around with the especially predators, and the whole system starts to break down. So that's it. Now, wolves don't need old growth forests they can live almost anywhere, but they have to be left alone and they have to have food. And unfortunately, there are practically no places they can survive where humans aren't in there killing them. I just heard about in Oregon, there were several wolves that were killed by some idiot hunter, or I'm sure it was a hunter, but it was a person with a gun. And a lot of hunters are decent and respect predators, but they're always some jerks. And so these wolves just were minding their own business. So that's why you need big wilderness areas. If you have a big wilderness, they can go way back in there, and it's pretty hard to get to them. And national parks don't have hunting. So they're like Yellowstone. Wolves are safe in Yellowstone, but if they walk out of Yellowstone, they can get blown away.
Right, so that brings up the issue of national parks versus national forests. I'm in Kentucky where there's Daniel Boone National Forest, and you've proposed that it should be a national park. And why is that?
Well, national parks, the first national park in the world was Yellowstone in 1872. And that started a whole movement worldwide. And there are now a couple thousand national parks in over 100 countries. And the reason is because national parks protect the landscape, they protect the historic features and geological features, they protect the wildlife, and they're open to people to enjoy them as long as you don't do anything harmful to any of the above. So it's a real boon for humans as well as wildlife and everything else. And so not surprisingly, most of the areas in the U.S. that are the most biodiverse and healthy and best air and water quality, et cetera, are national parks or wilderness areas, which are similar to national parks and are like an overlay on other public lands. National forests and Bureau of Land Management lands, which are only in the West, are what's called multiple use. But what it really means is resource extraction is number one. And so everything else is secondary to cutting down trees and livestock grazing and mining and drilling and so forth. None of that stuff is allowed in national parks or in wilderness areas. Actually, if they're on national forest lands, they have exceptions that allow, so they can still have livestock grazing. There's still hunting, and including trophy hunting for wolves or whatever, bison. So they're still not as protective as national parks. The national parks, the most protective is a wilderness area, which is under the Wilderness Act, a federal Wilderness Act. A wilderness area in a national park is the most protective area in the U.S.
Let's talk again a little bit about the benefits of forests to climate. You and I are familiar with something called the biotic pump theory. And what is that, and how does it play out in, say, the eastern United States?
Well, I'm not an expert on it because it's pretty complex, but the concept is that forests are basically driving this system of moisture, and the moisture creates its own weather, it creates its own airflow, and we've sort of known this before, but it's now becoming scientifically explained as to why. But that when you cut down forests, you can create drought. You can lose the forest. Might at some point the forest may not even be able to grow back because it's gotten so much drier, and that's because they're recycling the water, and it keeps the forest floor moist. It keeps the moisture level in the local area is higher than if you don't have a forest. We know that this then reduces the threat of fire because the forest is more moist. And there's a theory that, and we don't know for sure, but it's looking like it's probably true, that at some point you've reduced the amount of forest past a critical stage, and getting it back again can be really difficult. So the best thing to do is to not create that problem in the first place. But the point is that that has nothing to do with directly with biodiversity. Indirectly, it's critical to biodiversity, but it's something that you might not even think about as part of what drives forests. And another thing that we're learning about forests is that, and people may have heard of this, that the root systems of trees communicate in a way. It's not like talking, but there are mycorrhizal fungi that grow on the roots and that can link different trees to each other underground, and they can share nutrients, they can share carbon, they can support each other, and when you clear cut the forest, you wipe that out. And nobody really knows how long it takes for that, if ever, for that to reinstate itself. So, I mean, that's the critical thing. We don't know anything about forests. When people tell you that they are experts and they know oh yeah, don't trust me, we can clear cut that area, it'll be fine. They don't know what they're talking about. They're so complex.
Let's talk a little bit about, so we've been talking a little bit about the biotic pump and the ways that thinning forests and clear cutting forests can be harmful. You mentioned biomass. I did an interview with Scott Caranda of Dogwood Alliance, and he showed me a map of the southern United States. The southern United States is being cleared for biomass, which is taking trees, turning them into wood pellets, shipping them to Europe. And it's going on the heaviest along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, because those are the places where they're closest to the ocean. And you've got to think that thinning of the forests is going to affect the biotic pump, which it is a complex theory, but the simplest version of the benefits of it is that it's great to have mature forests close to the coast and have those be continuous as you progress inland. And if you don't have that, then if you're thinning the forests along the coast, then it's virtually certain that is going to adversely affect the rainfall, like in the rest of the South that is not close to the coast. So if agriculture is an issue at all, if you want steady, consistent rains, then stop thinning the forest. But it's exactly what we're doing. So what is the biomass industry, and how does it work, and what do you want people to know about that?
Well, I mean, it shows how little we know. Humans have always burned trees as fuel and had fireplaces or whatever, and then somebody came up with the idea of using trees as fuel to generate electricity, or to provide major league heating for either large buildings or on a large scale in private homes. And so these companies quickly geared up, seeing money to be made. And it's a total fake thing. That they claim, for example, that number one, the biggest fraud was they said, oh, it's carbon neutral to burn the trees. And this, for a while, they were getting away with this. I mean, it's intellectually so obviously stupid. They said, oh, well, we cut the trees down and then you burn them, but then new trees grow in their place and they're going to suck up all that carbon. So it's a perfect cycle right there. Well, unfortunately, it takes 100 years for the trees at best to grow back and suck up the carbon. And as we've said, we don't know, number one, if they're even going to be allowed to grow back. But even if they do, are they going to grow back the same way after we cut them over and over again? We don't know. And so and then some scientists did some math and said, well, actually, that doesn't make any sense at all. So you're basically spewing all this carbon out, and you're not going to get it back anytime soon, if ever. And the most critical time to reduce emissions and to increase carbon absorption is right now and for the next several decades. This is the most important time, and that's, of course, burning biomass. This is the worst time. You're spewing it all out right now. The other thing that they claimed was that they were using waste wood and sawdust and whatever. Well, the reality is, again, all you had to do is a little math. It's obvious there's not nearly enough of that, even if you accepted that was okay to burn. There's not even come close to enough of that to supply any major amount of stuff to burn for biomass. So what they do is they cut down forests, and some of them are pretty old trees. They're not maybe not ancient old growth, but some of them would be old growth if they were left alone. So this was another part of the fraud. And the thing is, what they've managed to do is bamboozle some international institutions to label this biomass energy as carbon neutral. And so all these trees you're mentioning that they're cutting down in the southeast, they're being turned into pellets, wood pellets, and then shipped over to England mainly, but also some other countries, and burned for electricity. And that's supposedly green energy. So when we hear that England has reduced its carbon footprint hugely in the energy sector, well, it hasn't. And in fact, we now know that burning trees is actually more polluting than coal. It spews out more carbon, it spews out more soot and air pollution. So the other thing is, when you make pellets, there's no regulation of what's in wood pellets. They use these chemical binder things to glue stuff. Who knows? It's probably carcinogenic. And it takes energy to make those. So how do you create these pellets? You grind the tree up, and then you put it through these machines where it presses it and then uses this binder stuff. And so it uses a lot of energy to create these pellets. And then, of course, to ship them overseas uses a lot of energy in the shipping lane. So that usually is not even considered as a part of the
right. And just
carbon.
strictly from a carbon standpoint, I don't think they even count the international shipping or the really energy intensive process that they use to grind up the wood, turn it into pellets, et cetera. There's lots of noise in the communities that have to deal with this. There's lots of pollution in the communities. They tend to be, historically disenfranchised people who have to live near these plants.
Yeah, it's really obscene. It's just totally, it's unbelievable that it goes to show how the greediness of these resource companies. They don't care, and they can get away with it, and there's a lot of money to be made, and they're spreading it around, I'm sure, amongst certain politicians who are happy to go along with it. But it's horrendous, and people will look back and say, how on earth did they let this happen? But it's still happening, even now, when there are no credible scientists who think this makes any sense, but we're still doing it.
Let's talk again about fire suppression.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating to me that a mature forest with all of its biological diversity makes for a better sponge to absorb rainfall, and then it holds on to all that. So how does that work? And what is the industry saying in contrast to that?
Right. Well, everybody's familiar with Smokey the Bear, and it's because in the past, foresters, uh, they wanted the trees to survive so they could cut them down. So they didn't want them to burn. So they thought fires were bad and tried to put all the fires out. And that's part of the mythology that we're dealing with now. They want to portray themselves as these really amazing wonder guys who know everything about forests and can do amazing things. And so they want us to believe that they were able to suppress fires for 100 years or more everywhere. Just about everywhere we suppressed wildfires. And so there's actually no evidence that that's true. I mean, think about it. Yeah, if you're talking about a fire right near a town, sure, the fire department will probably go out and spray it. Most fires are actually very small and they go out on their own. It's like 95, 96% of fires go out on their own without anybody doing anything. But even large wildfires, think about if you're out in northern Montana in 1955 and there's a big wildfire. There are no roads. There's no plane. You don't have planes maybe you have some World War II old junky plane. You're probably not though up there. There's no satellite imagery. There's no, so you see maybe you're in a fire watch thing. You see a fire miles away. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. They couldn't do anything about it. And if they did, it was some guys they drive some old truck as close as they could and they drag some, axes and so forth and try to cut some of the brush. I mean, there was nothing. In fact, even now, these large wildfires, you can't put them out. Humans can't put them out. It's all just a show. It's really just a pantomime, pretend thing. So all these guys, they spend all this money, they spew all this, they drop this toxic fire retardant stuff out of planes, they bulldoze, and so forth. And the fire goes out when it snows or rains or it hits the ocean or it hits a big river that's when it goes out. So the whole thing is a big fraud. And more we're learning that actually large wildfires are a good thing. They're natural and they happen when it's super dry, hot, windy, and there's a source of flame. In the past it was lightning. Now you got humans who inadvertently or on purpose start fires, so that's a problem. But in reality, even if you do that, it's not going to burn unless it's the right conditions. So you can go out in Massachusetts, walk out into the woods and throw a match down there, or even try to light it. Normally it won't burn. That's not going to burn because it's not the right circumstances. So the whole thing is a fake. And what it is you got this whole smoke jumping culture of guys, these macho guys who it's really fun to get out with the guys and get out there and do stuff. And you think we're doing something and we're fighting that fire. And then they can brag about how they fought the whatever fire and so forth. And they make a lot of money. There are companies now that contract to the Forest Service to do this and training. And so we're spending billions of dollars on this useless, and plus they're doing a lot of damage in the meantime. And of course, but what they're doing is using this as an excuse for logging, thinning. They want to thin tens of million, I think it's 70 million acres of public forest that they want to do thinning. They also do prescribed burning, which is here fire is supposed to be such a big problem. Well, they go out and burn, and it's hard to get these forests to burn a lot of times. So they have to burn at bad times when it can get away, and that sometimes happens. And it's based on this idea that we suppressed fire. And so for all this time, we were so efficient at suppressing fire. So all these forests have all this undergrowth. It's just all, and it's fuel, just like in your fireplace, like putting logs in your fireplace. Well, the reality is, big trees don't burn anyway. And as you know, if you think about it, the place that has the most fuel in the forest is the Pacific Northwest, like Olympic National Park. And guess what never happens in Olympic National Park? Fire, because it's damp and it's old growth forest. So the reality is, fuel is not, if you're going to have a big fire, fuel is, sure, it'll burn, but it'll burn even without all that fuel. It doesn't matter. And when you cut the forest, you open it up, it dries out. It's dry. The wind can whip through the forest. You've got all this junk that's left after logging. So the reality is, you're making it worse, not better. But the reality is, it's going to burn. If it's going to burn, it's going to burn. And the famous fire in California, the Paradise in Paradise, California, I think it was the Camp Fire. I think that was the one called the Camp Fire. It was this town right next to I think it was partly national forest and partly industrial timberland. And interestingly, there was a bunch of that was thinned not long before, a couple of years before, to supposedly to prevent large wildfires. And what happened is, there was a fire, and the fire whipped right through all of those areas and hit the town. And that's the other really damaging part of this whole fake fire stuff, is that the real problem is that people's homes are susceptible to burning, and they build them they build them right up near forests that can burn. And there are things that people can do to reduce the threat of fire damaging their home. For example, having cedar shake shingles on your house is not a good idea. Having brush and stuff right near your house, having flammable trees right near your house. Apparently, one of the biggest problems with houses burning is if you have vents in the roof, even sometimes dog doors. What'll happen is, there's huge winds when you have a big wildfire, and what happens is, these embers blow. They can blow like a mile away from the fire, and then they land. And if they land somewhere where it can burn, then when this house burns, it goes over to the next house and the next house and the next house. And that horrible fire in Hawaii, that's on Maui. That's what happened, is it went from house to house after it started some of the houses on fire. And that was a grass fire mainly. That was not even a forest. And a lot of fires actually are grass fires. That's the other fraudulent thing about this. For example, there was a fire in east of, it was, I think, sort of east of Greeley, Colorado, along the Front Range there, but it was a subdivision that was out in the grassland. It was not in the forest. It was east of the mountains of several miles. And there was this fire. It was a grass fire. I think it was started by lightning, maybe, and it burned a whole bunch of houses. I think a few people died. There were no forests there at all. So when you have and it was because it was dry, hot, windy. So it's another sort of a hubris for humans that we think that, we can, whatever nature does, we can do. Nobody can fight hurricanes. You can't. So, but we have this fake thing about thinking we can fight wildfires, but it really is it's a waste of time, and it's damaging, it's expensive, and it's they're trashing our forests using that as an excuse.
Let's talk a little bit about industry propaganda. You've been talking about, the false messaging that is related to wildfires. What is some of the other false messaging that the timber industry indulges in, and what are some of the economic pressure? Can you give us an overview of the economic pressures on our forests?
Well, to start with, the only the only legitimate reason to cut forests is to provide timber, pulp for paper or whatever. That's aside from whether we need it or not, or should be doing it, but that's the only reason, legitimate reason to be cutting trees to any degree. That's aside from, safety for people where a tree might fall in their house or whatever. That's a different, but just in terms of economic uses. But it's very clever, the forest industry is very clever. It's sort of like the tobacco industry. They're constantly dodging and weaving and coming up with new excuses. And so we just talked about fire. That's one of the excuses. Another one is we need to cut forests. We need to clear standing forests. And this is in the East is a big thing now because the young forests, which is basically shrubby stuff that grows up after you cut the forest down, clear cut it. We're running out of that kind of habitat. It's shrinking, and all these species that need that young forest, like woodcock and grouse and so forth, are declining. And if we don't, we need to create more of this habitat, or we're going to lose those species. And birds, there are all kinds of birds, songbirds that need this. Well, it's true that there are species that need that kind of habitat. The problem is there's plenty of that habitat. In fact, there's more now than there was in 1600, way more. It's all over. Anybody who drives around, just drive around and look at the landscape. You'll see all kinds of open habitat. And those species are not the least bit endangered. I co-authored a paper on this, which we deliberately looked to see if we could find any species that needs clearing of standing forests. I'm not talking about just scrubby stuff that you just mow or whatever. I'm talking about, they're cutting down even mature forests. We could not find one species that needs that to survive or thrive. All these species are perfectly doing fine. And what it is it's mainly driven by hunting groups, because it's true, the number of woodcock and grouse or whatever, which they love to hunt, are declining, but that's because they were abnormally high. Because think about in the mid 1800s, almost all of New England, and then a little bit later, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Southeast, were just mowed down and either turned into farms or grazed by cattle, and open lands. And then what happened is a lot of the farmland was not good for farming, so the farmers moved west to Ohio or whatever, just abandoned the farm, and so that grew back. And so by the 1960s, you had a lot of recovering old farms and so forth, and areas that have been clear cut where they were young scrubby stuff. Well, that's exactly what these species love. So their numbers boomed, except it was abnormal. It was artificial. And so then the forests have been recovering after that. And the reason they've been allowed to recover is there weren't enough big trees to cut. So the foresters left them alone. Now they want to go back and cut all those trees. But so you have a situation where there's what's called the shifting baseline syndrome, which is basically what you grew up with in your experience seems normal to you. And so you think that's normal and you want to keep it. But so you got all these guys who are managing the forests and wildlife guys in the agencies who grew up in the 1960s or 70s, or they were trained by guys who grew up in that period. And guess what? The landscape had all kinds of open areas. There were all kinds of woodcock all over the place. And so these guys are going, oh my God, we're losing all my favorite birds and so forth. We got to do something about this. And that's literally what's going on. There's no real science to back up that there's any need for any of this clearing. It's all because this is what these guys who are in charge want, and they've managed to put together an excuse that sounds plausible to the public. Who doesn't want to save birds and and wildlife and so forth. So they go, well, I don't like clear cutting, but if we have to do it to save poor little songbirds, I guess we'll have to do it. And that's exactly what they're doing. So what's needed, well, the converse of this is that there are hardly any old growth forests left. Even in the West, it's a very small percentage of what used to be there. The Northeast in particular, and the Appalachians and inland areas in the South, they were pretty much solid old growth forests before 1600. They were big old, they weren't all big old trees, but they were dominated by these big old trees. They had, as we talked about earlier, they had blowdowns, there were openings, but they were naturally created by weather and hurricanes and storms. And that was normal. And so all the species that evolved, they evolved with that kind of a landscape. They didn't evolve with huge open landscapes that they're creating now. But we hardly have any of that kind of old growth forest left now. In New England, it's like 0.1% of the forest is old growth, when it used to be about 95% or so. So yet these guys are cutting down forests that would be future old growth if we left them alone and let them grow back. So they're actually undermining the creation of the protection of what we really need, old growth forests, and all the habitats that go with them. And they're creating something that's already common, these open habitats. And they're convincing people that this is a good thing, and they're doing it all over the place. A lot of private land trusts and so forth, they're doing this all over because they've been convinced to do this. So
why don't we take a couple of minutes, as much time as you want, to talk about your accomplishments and the accomplishments of Restore the Northwoods, and, for instance, proposed 3.2 million acres, and the name of the park escapes me. The Maine Woods National Park and Preserve. And then we'll make sure people know how to find you online.
I got into the idea of expanding national parks and wilderness because I ran into all the things we've been talking about 30 years ago dealing with the U.S. Forest Service in Michigan. I'm from Michigan originally, and I studied these national forest plans. The first ones that came out were in the 1980s. And my job was to read these things. There were 3 national forests in Michigan, or are, and read them and do a critique and pick them apart and see what's good, what's bad. And almost everything was bad. And I was shocked at how terrible they were and how stupid a lot of the stuff was, how they were self-contradictory, how they'd say stuff with no basis. I'd ask them about, well, what about this? Why are you saying this? And they would just say, well, that's just what we think. And we know, we go out and look, and that's how it is out there. You got to, thin and blah, blah, blah. And most of the excuses were the same then as they are now. The main new thing is climate, where they claim that logging is good for climate change, which is the opposite. So I at that point, to me, it was clear we have to try to stop them from doing this stupid stuff. But these guys who control these public lands are entrenched. There are a lot of them. They have a lot of money. They have resources. They have credibility. They shouldn't, but they do, because people think they know what they're talking about. So fighting defense against them is really a losing battle in the long term. You got to do it when they want to cut down this beautiful forest that of course, but they'll come back and find some other excuse. So at that point, I said, what we need to do is protect as much land from these guys as possible. So we need to designate wilderness areas. So I was involved in designating about 90 some odd thousand acres of wilderness on national forests in Michigan, which really disgustingly was about pretty much all the roadless areas that qualified at the time. Out of 2.7 million acres of national forest. then, of course, I ended up being hired by the Wilderness Society to move to Boston, and it was the same thing in New England. And so we said, we need to, New England is almost all private land. We need to buy a bunch of land and make it public. And in northern Maine, especially, these timber and paper companies are just ruining the forest. They don't care. There's no long-term plan for protection. So we proposed a big national park, 3.2 million acres. So that's the size of Yellowstone and Yosemite put together. And there are no permanent residents in that boundary. There are no towns. It's under state jurisdiction, like parts of Alaska, unorganized townships. So you could if you buy this land from these big companies, you own it. You own everything. You can close all the roads. You can let it go back. And right now, so this was in 1994 when we first did this. Well, now almost all of those companies that were there are gone. They've been bought by these venture capitalist firms and so forth that are just looking for a quick buck. So we could still buy this land. It would cost more, but still, if you had $1 billion, you could buy pretty much most of this proposed park, I think. And most of these forests are relatively young because they were just mowing them down like crazy in the 1970s. So, but they're growing back, and if we left them alone, you would be absorbing huge amounts of carbon, and this would be the wolves are coming back here and there to northern Maine. They get killed because the hunters find them. But if you had a big national park, it would give them habitat to survive. So we would get wolves back. We'd have the full range of, these rivers would be cleaner. We could get rid of the dams eventually and let the salmon come back. But even then, that's not enough. I mean, if we're talking about, there's the 30 by 30 idea of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030, only about 3% of New England has that protection. And that's actually, most of that is not permanent either. So, so now we're looking for other places in New England to protect. And there are 2 national forests, the Green Mountain and White Mountain. Those could be turned into national parks or monuments. There's state lands, and we're working to protect most state lands in Massachusetts, which would up the protected areas to about 9% of the state. And people think of Massachusetts as being totally like Boston, but actually there's quite a bit of open space and a lot of forests that have grown back. But we also, in doing the national park, the Maine Woods National Park campaign, we got a lot of attention because we really had the only big national park proposal out there for many years. And even now, I don't think there are any as large as that being proposed. And so we would talk to groups and activists in other parts of the country, and they'd heard about it, and they said, how did you do that? How are you, how are you going to succeed? What's your answer to this complaint and this problem? And pretty soon we're going, maybe we ought to help these groups. We know we've been through the mill here. Maybe we can give them some advice and ideas. And so a number of other park proposals have sprouted in other places. And then in talking to people, it's clear that we need to join together and work together, or we're going to, otherwise these powerful timber and other interests just beat you down locally. You can't compete on a local level.
Let me ask you, as I shared with you, I'm in Kentucky. We have the Daniel Boone National Forest, which is not protected because it's not a park.
Mm-hmm.
What would it take, and what would be some of the main kind of things that you would have to do to organize an effort to turn Daniel Boone National Forest into a park?
Well, the first thing is you need to get together all the people who are unhappy with the current management. And there are a lot of them in many places. And I know with the Daniel Boone, there certainly are. And they're doing good work and they're organized, but obviously they're not winning the long-term battle here. You can't, you may save a little bit here and there, but it's not going to be a winner. But what you do is what you really need to do is people need to know what national parks are all about, and most people don't know. It's sort of a lost art. There have been so few national parks created in recent years that hardly anybody in the conservation world even knows the legal basis or how you create them or what they can and can't do, what is qualified as a park. There are a lot of people who think, oh, my favorite place couldn't qualify as a national park. Well, usually that's not true. If you got 15 acres out somewhere, well, maybe not. But Daniel Boone National Forest is big, and it's already owned by the public. That's a big step forward right there. We've proposed Cumberland Plateau National Park that would go all the way from the Daniel Boone down to southern Tennessee and take in Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area, which is federal, and then there's the Obed Wild and Scenic River. There are quite a few state lands, many of which are being logged for early successional wildlife under this bogus wildlife thing. So you piece that all together, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres that could be, and it wouldn't be in one big piece, but that's not required. Most people think, oh, you got to have a big square like Yellowstone or you can't do it. Well, actually, there are a number of parks that are in various pieces. Acadia National Park is part of its. There are two islands that have part of it, and then there's a mainland portion, and there are towns and things in between. So you totally could do it. What you need, and then to accomplish it, you need to, with federal land, the Congress can just pass legislation to designate it as a national park. They can just do it. And the president can designate any federal land as a national monument. So President Biden could declare the Daniel Boone National Forest as a national monument tomorrow if he wanted to, or even if he wanted to, he couldn't do it quite that soon because there'd be a lot of political stuff going on. But right, as people may know, there have been a sort of a string of national monuments with President Obama and then ending with Trump, but now Biden has done a number of monuments, and there are a number of other ones he's probably going to do. And the reason I think he's very open to doing this, but he can't just go and do whatever because politically it can be very difficult. But what's happened is there's a lot of grassroots support, and those grassroots activists have gone to the Biden administration and said, Mr. President, here we have this area, we'd like you to designate it as a national monument. And these are usually places where they get the congressional delegation of the state to support it. If you're lucky, local politicians, but often not. Now, the Daniel Boone, of course, there's, other than the governor of Kentucky, who probably would be very careful, even though he might be personally sympathetic, I don't know, to that kind of thing. But the members of Congress in Kentucky and Tennessee generally are not going to be friendly to something like that. So you really have to, but that's the case. That's usually the case with proposed national parks all over the place. In the West, most of the places that are qualified as national parks are out in rural areas. And that's where you're going to tend to get opposition because people have been told, oh, it's going to ruin you're going to lose your job. There's going to be no economy. You're going to end up with a ghost town. It's big government's going to take over. They're going to kick you out. It's going to be locked up. It's all this bogus stuff. And so what I tell people is don't let the naysayers deter you. If you know this area deserves to be protected and it's not adequately protected now, you need to start going for it. And we can help you. There are other people who can help. And if we work together as a national coalition, I think we can really get a national movement going, where then you start to blow past some of the opposition because everybody loves national parks. Over and over again, there are public opinion surveys that show overwhelming support for national parks, including new national parks and monuments too, which are the alter ego really. And there was just a survey done in the West among most of the Western states, and it was like 84% of people support parks and even more parks. The Pew Charitable Trust does surveys, public opinion surveys regularly. And the latest one, which was just a few months ago, they asked people, what is your view of these federal agencies and departments? Is it favorable or unfavorable? And every year, every time they do it, the top two are the Postal Service and the National Park Service. And this time, the National Park Service was the top, and way higher than, those two are way higher than any other agency. Postal Service is probably down because DeJoy, the terrible guy running it, has made some enemies probably, and people have some, but so, you know, the people who want to continue exploiting forests want you to believe that parks and monuments are controversial, that they're, you know, it's really a problem for most people, think it's radical. I mean, we were told all this stuff in Maine. It's radical. It's going to really block up everything. It's going to ruin the economy. So you ought to just give it up now, because you're not going to be able to do it and no one's going to support it. But what we found is a lot of people quietly agreed with us about the need for protection. And I'm sure that's probably true with the Daniel Boone National Forest. There are a lot of people who are quiet, who are really unhappy with the stuff they're seeing going on. And if you can tell them, look, there's an alternative future here that actually will protect the forest, create new jobs, because we know that national parks and monuments create new jobs, and they diversify the economy. And it improves your quality of life for all the reasons we talked about, why forests are good for people's health and so forth. National parks that protect the forests are good for you. They're good for your health and your well-being. They're even good for people's mental health now. They know that going into nature is good for you. It's relaxing and comforting, and it helps, you know, with depression and so forth. Well, I can guarantee going into a clear cut in the national forest is not going to help you with any of those things.
Right.
So,
well, Michael, this has been a great conversation. Why don't we make sure people know how to get in touch with you?
Yes, we have a website, restore.org. Pretty simple. We're a membership group. We're small, but we could certainly use anybody's membership and donation of any amount people can afford. That's what we don't get big grants from rich foundations. We depend on our members. And we are, although we're mainly focused on the Northeast, as I said, we're working to build a national campaign for new national parks. So people who, we have some information on our website about that. We're going to have a new website just dedicated to the national parks pretty soon. So I hope people will check it out. And we have a sign up if people want to get on our information email list. We're glad to keep people informed. So,
sounds great. It is a good website that makes it easy for people to browse and also contact you. So, Michael Kellett of Restore the Northwoods, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to do it.